This service layer in the middle, of course, holds the business logic, and it is also required to communicate with the repository layer to fulfill any data needs as well. The repository layer of the application will in turn communicate with the database. Let's take a quick look at the repository layer as well. In a typical application, the repository layer is where we write all the data access objects, but in here I'm using Spring Data. So when using Spring Data, there's no need to write data access objects. You can use any JPA provider. You also get automatic custom queries and manual custom queries, which I'll explain later. This is how it all works. There's a commit class in the application. There's a commit table in the database. Spring Data is going to do all the hard work getting the comment back and forth. So what I'm going to do is create the commit repository interface, extending the CRUD repository interface, which provides some basic CRUD operations. CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. These are the methods of the CRUD repository interface. For now, I'll use the findAll method to retrieve all the comments in the repository and then filter by post ID in the service layer. Later on, I'll use an automatic custom query in the repository to do that as well. Now, coming back to the commit service test. I want to provide the commit repository dependency into the commit service object when it is created. So I'm going to provide it as a mock inside of the test class. So now I'm going to create this commit repository interface. Create interface commit repository. I'll select that. I want it in the src main Java source folder. So the package, I'm going to change this bit to repository. And I want to extend this from the CRUD repository interface from Spring. Now, this CRUD repository is a generic interface which requires two generic types. So first one is the type which we are writing this repository for, which is the comment. So I'm going to provide that type here. Then this ID is the type of the primary key of this comment. So we don't have a primary key yet, so I'm going to add one. So I've added a primary key which is of type int. So I'm going to add integer here. So I'm going to add the @mock annotation on top of this. So, and then here inject mocks. And what I'm going to do here is Mockito annotations, init mocks, this. So when we add this line, it will initialize this class under test with the dependencies that are marked with @mock annotation. So now that I've set up the commit repository mock, what I'm going to do is run these tests again. I'm getting the same results. So in order to fix this test, what I'm going to do is, first of all, I should provide this commit repository dependency into this commit service class, and then use that commit repository to return the list of comments instead of creating it in here. So now that I have the commit repository in here, I'm going to use that to find all the comments that are there in the database. So if you look at this method, findAll, the return type is an iterable. So instead of an iterable, what I want is a stream. There are a few other things that I could do. I could simply override this method inside of the commit repository to provide me a stream or a list or whatever I want. But here I'm going to use the stream support from Java 8 to create a stream with this iterable. So I don't want a parallel stream. I'm going to provide false here. So this is going to give me the stream of comments. I'm going to sort it through and send the ones which has the same post ID as this one. So I'm going to rename this. I'm going to filter all the comments. The post ID should be equal to this post ID parameter, and then I'm going to collect this into a list. So this part is done, and it's still not going to fix this test, but I'm going to run it anyway. So now both tests are failing. So let me first fix the first one. Get comments by post ID. So we want a list which is not empty. So we should tell this comment repository to return a list of comments when the find all method has been called on that. So I'm going to use when from Mockito. I'm actually going to copy this list over here. So I will create a field called comments for this list of comments. And inside of this method, I'm going to initialize it and then add some values to it and return. So I'm telling the comment repository to return this list of comments when the find all method has been called on that. So if I run this again, now we have that test passing, and the second one, I'm going to use the same list. So now we have the same list, and the test goes like this. The post ID is 1, and we're expecting a list of 4 comments. So there should be 4 comments with the post ID set to 1. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's done, and I'm going to run this again. So both tests are now passed. So now that we have all the tests passing, it's time for some refactoring. I want to move all these filtering logic to the database. That is, I want to send a query like this. I want the database to filter the comments by post ID before returning it to the application. So something like select all from comment where the post ID equals the one we provide. So since we're using Spring Data, it's going to be really easy to do. We just have to write the method declaration, and I call it an automatic custom query. So again, these are all the methods that are available to use from the CRUD repository. I have used find all, but wouldn't it be great if there was a method here to find by post ID as well? Well, even though there isn't such a method in this interface, It doesn't mean that we have to write an implementation for such a method if we wanted it. This is one of the coolest features of Spring Data. You can actually get away with just the method declaration in your repository interface. That's what I called an automatic custom query. There is a specific naming strategy for the method name though, so that the framework can build the correct query. If I wanted to find all the comments which has a particular post ID, I would name the method findByPostID and pass in the post ID as a parameter. Simple as that. Now what I meant by manual custom query is actually the ability to write a named query by using the @query annotation. So here is an example. So before moving on, I just want you to notice that we are extending from the CRUD repository, and if you take a look at the type hierarchy, there is our commit repository that we created, and then there is paging and sorting repository. So instead of the iterable that we got for find all in the CRUD repository, if you use paging and sorting repository, it has these two methods overridden, and then there is a JPA repository which you can use, and it returns a list instead of an iterable for the find all methods. So you can use paging and sorting repository or JPA repository depending on your requirement instead of this CRUD repository to extend your repository from. So back to the commit service test. What I'm going to do here is, instead of using the find all method, I'm going to use find all by post ID, and I'm going to pass in a post ID. In this case it's 1, so I'll provide 1 here as well. And now we haven't added this method to our interface yet, so I'll quickly add that one. So create a method, and I want this method to return a stream of comments. So now coming back to the test, the return value from this method findAllByPostID is a stream. So we need to provide a stream here. So I'm going to get a stream from this list and return that. So now I'm going to run this test. So now that test is passing, and on to the next one. This method was initially written to test whether this getCommentsByPostID method would filter the comments given by the repository by post ID. But now that we have moved the filtering logic into the repository or the database, we don't need this test anymore. So I'm going to remove this. But I'm going to add a new test which will verify that this findAllByPostID method from the commit repository will be called by this getCommentsByPostID method. So I've named this test method test getCommentsByPostID, calls repository to fetch comments. So that's exactly what we're going to test here. And I'm going to copy this bit because this is the actual method call. And I will just pass in 1, or maybe, okay, I'm gonna create this local variable. And set it to 1. Then I'm going to use verify from Mockito, and I'm going to now give the mock object here which is the comment repository. And then I can define how many times this should be called. It's just once. And then I want to verify that this findAll by post ID method has been called with the post ID parameter. So now let's run the tests. Okay, now we have this getCommentsByPostId method and getCommentsByPostId calls repository to fetch comments. Both methods are passing. Now I want to clean up this test a little bit because this is a very simple test, getCommentsByPostId, and it should return a list which is not empty. That's all that we are testing, so we don't need all these different post IDs in comments. So I'm going to remove these because sometime later if I look at this test I should be able to understand this without any trouble or confusion about why we have all those post IDs. So this is what the repository will return, and then in turn will be returned by the getCommentsByPostId method. So I'll run these tests again. Okay, good.